I think the problem often with humans is that we get into that state, we release all that blood sugar, we're ready, we have a cortisol spike, we're ready, and then we don't have to fight or flee because so much of our lives is around emotional turmoil and other kinds of, like what you described, interpersonal conflict, which is very real stress. But if you actually do raise your blood sugar and then you do run or you do get in a fight, you actually use that blood sugar. You're burning it off because your muscles are using it. And that's a relatively healthy physiologic response to stress.
Welcome to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast. On today's episode, we talk about metabolic health, how it can help regulate your sleep, appetite, weight, and energy. Although the concept of metabolic health isn't new, the latest research concluded that it is one of the leading causes of infertility, diabetes, depression, and even erectile dysfunction. By leveraging biosensors like continuous glucose monitors, Levels, a new wearable tech company, raised a total of $50 million to a number of high-profile investors, including Mark Randolph, the co-founder of Netflix, and Dick Costolo, the former CEO of Twitter, to help us discover how our food affects our health. Today, we talk to the head of clinical product about the ultimate guide to metabolic health and its 5 key biomarkers, why insulin resistance is on the rise and how it can be detrimental to your health, how many of the foods you think are healthy are actually not, and why your physical appearance doesn't determine how healthy you are. So please welcome the head of clinical product for Levels, Dr. Lauren Kelley-Chew. Well, Lauren, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a subject that I've been getting to know for about a year, actually. I think it was probably January, February last year that I first sort of realized that this was, I guess you call it metabolic health, was something that I needed to be conscious of. And I suppose as someone that liked to think that I was really healthy, had a great diet. When I sort of started to learn about it, I realized that I've got so much more to know. So yeah, this is going to be interesting. One of the things as I was preparing for this, I was reading an article and it said only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. Is that a fair assessment from your side? And why do you think Americans are so bad at being metabolically healthy?
I think actually the research suggests that number is even lower now. So the most recent research reflects that essentially about 93% of Americans have at least some sign of insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. And I think this is almost completely due to lifestyle choices, having to do with diet, exercise, stress, sleep, all of the things that we know. I think many of us know that we should be focused on, but for a variety of reasons are really hard to really kind of lock into place when it comes to day-to-day habits. And so unfortunately, the result of that is that the vast majority of us, and I have been in that group as well, so none of us are exempt, is that many of us are living with a sense of normal that actually doesn't need to be our body's normal in terms of the way that we feel as we experience the world and our bodies and our lives.
Mm. It was the thing that I guess there was another piece of research I got when I was looking into you guys, and it mentioned this disparity where I think this was from the United Kingdom actually, where it said 50% of people consider themselves somewhat healthy, and I kind of I put myself in that category as well, probably maybe more healthier than most, but I sort of had this perception that I was maybe healthier than what I was until I started to sort of look under the hood at really what was going on. And I suppose it's very easy if you don't understand what you're looking at, and you probably look at yourself in the mirror and think, okay, well, my genes are reasonably good, and I think I'm eating quite well compared to what it tells me in online or somewhere. You kind of have this maybe false perception that you're actually healthier than what you are. Is that your sort of findings, would you say?
I definitely think that health and appearances are not always linked and often are not linked. I can say that when I found out that I had prediabetes in my mid-20s, my BMI was probably around 19. I was an avid runner. And in fact, when one of my physicians found out about this, she said, well, there's no way that that's correct because look at the way you look. There's just no possibility that this is happening. And the reality is it was happening under the surface. And I think it's kind of an interesting dichotomy because on the one hand, I actually do think that a lot of people, if they really pause to think about how they feel in the day to day, how their energy is, how their moods are, how their skin health is, how their hormonal health is, I think actually many people would be able to pull out things that they would say, actually, you know what, that doesn't feel completely healthy to me, right? For example, I'm sleeping, but I never really feel rested, or I never really have energy, or I'm eating, but I'm hungry half an hour later. So I think on the one hand, if we pause, actually many people could highlight aspects of their health that could be improved. But on the other hand, many of the traditional physician assessments of health, the lab testing, the other kind of parameters that we've defined as being healthy, will tell those same people that everything is perfectly fine and there's nothing to worry about. And so I think where the science is evolving now and where the health tech field is really evolving is to say, we need to find ourselves somewhere in between those things. We need to be able to be in sync with what we feel in our bodies. And we also need to have evolving medicine and ways of looking through data and analytics at the way our body's functioning to get a much more clear view of what's actually happening behind the scenes.
I think you're right. I was gonna, when you mentioned that statement at first, it was going through my mind, and I'm like, do I agree with that or don't I agree? But as the more I thought about it, I'm like, yeah, actually, you're right, because I think the word that you said there is pause, and I think that's something that we probably don't really do very often. You go along, and just 1 week goes into the next, and 1 month goes into the next, and you just get through, and you deal with, okay, I'm not feeling too good today, and I'm struggling to get up today, and this is a little bit more difficult, and I don't feel great mentally today. But I think when you do start to have some sort of interaction that almost like causes you to pause, you're like, okay, well, or even if you diarize things, well, that wasn't how it used to be, and I think some of it is just you become unconscious probably to some of these small details, and my guess is before you know it, you're at a position 3-4 years down the road where you've got a big problem straight in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that we've normalized as a society many aspects of health that actually are not optimal. For example, you'll hear people often say, well, as you age, you just naturally gain weight. I don't think that actually has to be the natural. And of course, the body changes and there's physiologic changes that we have to honor and appreciate. But that's actually more just a description of what we've noticed happening as a group. I don't think there's a reason that has to be the normal. And that's the same with so many things. For example, acne. Now, there are certainly reasons why someone might have acne that are separate from metabolic health, but there's a lot of acne that's driven by people eating a lot of sugar and carbs. And yet that's another thing where someone will say, oh, that's just who I am. I have bad skin. And again, very complex. And I don't want to diminish how complex these things are. But I think that many people have accepted something as being, quote, just who they are, whether that is weight, whether that is skin, whether that is hormonal fluctuations, mood fluctuations, things around interrupted sleep. All of these things, even mood, mental health, we know is connected to metabolic health. There's like, this is just who I am. And I think part of my mission and goal is to help people say, maybe that's who you have been. That's been your experience of being in your body. But we don't know that that's necessarily who you are versus that's just the outcome of your behaviors right now and the lifestyle choices that you're making right now. And I've had so many friends and family members completely shift what they think of as their normal by changing their lifestyles. And it's easier said than done. But I think just knowing that there is potentiality there is really powerful.
And the other thing that I guess we probably don't acknowledge as well is you're not just in this battle alone with yourself. You've actually got big companies out there that are making it even more difficult to stay on track. Another thing I picked up from your report is the UK in particular spends more money on products, on promotion, than any other European country. And most of those promotions are for foods which are actually not good for you. So you're probably going shopping and looking to buy things, and whilst you're doing that, you're kind of being forced into areas for financial reasons that are getting you to consume things that are not bad for you. And I was actually surprised that the things that I thought, and I think most magazines and media that write about healthy things, I was surprised how many things that probably 80% of people that think are relatively good for you are actually terrible if you are able to get some sort of measurement from that.
And I'm assuming by those things you're referring to things that, for example, are marketed as being heart healthy, but are actually very high in carbs or refined sugars. Are those the types of products that you're thinking of?
Yeah, well, just you can I'll go to I shop at Whole Foods, to be honest, which is you go in there and you think you're kind of getting pretty good food, and this is no dig at Whole Foods. I think it's a great place. But so many things in there whether it's, you go in there for a snack and you get some of these healthy drinks or proteins or smoothies or bars and a lot of the kind of, I guess, pre-made stuff. And I was, obviously using levels to track what was going on. And I was just shocked. I'm like, there was just so many things I was starting to have to eliminate from my diet that I've been taking for years, going along thinking, well, patting myself on the back, I'm doing a great job. I'm eating and drinking really well. When in fact, some of this stuff unknowingly is creating potential problems.
Absolutely. And I would expand that to even say it's unknowingly, and it's actually often intentionally on the part of the manufacturers to market food in a certain way. And there's so many layers of this in terms of government subsidies and the kind of legacy of how these products have come to be. But I completely agree with you. And actually on my Instagram channel, I've started doing a series that I'm calling Blood Sugar Sherlock. And really what I do is I go and look at these kind of themes of healthy products, and I just really go into the nutrition labels and look at what's actually in them and what the impact would actually be on blood sugar and metabolic health. And as you alluded to, it's pretty shocking. For example, if you take a stroll down the cereal aisle, many of those cereals, including the ones marketed to children, including the ones that have hearts on the front of the box, are actually containing more sugar than a donut. And many times the equivalent of 2 donuts. And the same is true in the yogurt aisle. The same is true often with canned soups. I mean, energy bars, the list just goes on and on and on. And I think it's really something that needs to be fixed at a system level. But one thing that we can do, for example, through podcasts like this, is empowering people to look at the nutrition labels, to look for things that have short list of ingredients that you recognize, ingredients that are not processed, and to look at the nutrition label in terms of carbs and sugar. And to say, you know what, even if this is made just of what appear to be whole foods, like just of oats, but it packs 35 grams of carbs and 17 grams of sugar, there is no way that your body will be able to respond to that in an easy way. It will raise your blood sugar and it will create a spike of insulin. And over time, those are the patterns that lead to metabolic dysfunction. But again, I think most consumers are really at a massive disadvantage. There's information asymmetry because we are looking at things that are marketed as being healthy. We are being told even by sometimes our physicians that eating things like oatmeal is really the best thing we can do for our blood sugar, when in fact the science is suggesting that in many cases that's not true. And so there's just so much confusion out there, and it's very difficult for people to wade through, even people who have a medical background. Even with an MD, I'm there in the grocery store, also at Whole Foods often, trying to figure out what is actually good for my body and what isn't. That's why I started making the videos, because I figured if I'm doing this, I might as well at least share the work that I'm doing, and maybe others can skip the line in terms of having to do the same for themselves. But it's very difficult.
Introducing the next big thing in functional training, the Escape Barrow, a revolutionary training tool that combines a loaded farmer's carry with a sled push to develop hip, grip, and core strength. Developed in partnership with Pete Holman, inventor of the TRX Rip Trainer and Nautilus Glute Drive, the Escape Barrow can be rolled, pushed, dragged, and carried. The Escape Barrow packs a punch with an impressive load capacity of 440 pounds, and with a 2-stage galvanized paint covering process, it's also ideal for outdoor use. So head over to escapefitness.com/barrow. That's escapefitness.com/barrow to find out more. Enjoy the rest of this episode.
It is. I was in New York probably 3 weeks ago. We did an event. And so the first day I jumped into an Uber, went to Whole Foods, and I thought, well, I'm going to get my food sorted out for the week so I can kind of I make sure I'm not getting really hungry and grabbing anything I can get. And I did the same thing. I thought, well, I'll go and get some yogurt, which I did, and I've got that figured out. I've got a brand I go to there. And then I thought, well, look, I want to get some sort of cereals or granola or something to put with it, because I thought it's a quick and easy thing that I can have. And so I went and knowing what I did about how some of the granolas are super spiked my blood sugar, I thought, well, I'm going to go down and get one that's good. And as you know, you probably go down the aisle and there's 2 huge aisles and about 4 or 5 shelves of stuff. And I went to all the ones that kind of was really branded. I started with the ones that was branded as super healthy and really good for you and high in fiber and all this sort of stuff. And then I sort of shortlisted them because there was just so many, and I didn't have the whole evening to spend in there. So I shortlisted the ones that I thought looked the best. And then I started looking at the sugars and carbohydrates in them, and it was so difficult to actually get something that I knew was going to be good. And I think out of all of the stuff that was on there, I probably found one that was the worst tasting of all of them. When I got it back, I thought I couldn't even eat this, like cardboard. But it was really bad. But it was just, I must have spent probably 15 or so minutes in there just shortlisting the cereals. And yet, if you hadn't have done that and you'd have just gone from the packaging and the sort of front-facing quick decision marketing, you'd have probably taken a number of them that clearly wouldn't have been ideal. And it kind of makes me think, well, how many other foods do you just walk by all the time that have this really strong messaging and are actually doing not a lot of good for you? So in relation to that, I was going to ask you then, because this is probably the subject that I want to talk about, is how do you define what is metabolic health?
So our bodies are made up of about 40 trillion cells, and every cell needs energy to function. And so really, metabolism is just the collection of the complex biochemical processes that convert the food we eat into energy for our cells. And when all of those processes are happening smoothly, we call that good metabolic health. But unfortunately, for many of the reasons that we've discussed, primarily lifestyle choices, that process is very disrupted in most people. And that's where you start to go down the road of metabolic dysfunction. I think many of us are familiar with diabetes and prediabetes as issues with blood sugar, but those are actually very advanced forms of insulin resistance. And there's actually insulin resistance that happens long before that. For example, we know that people have insulin resistance for 10 years or more prior to getting a prediabetes diagnosis. And so really it's this spectrum. And we want to be, of course, towards the first part of the spectrum where all of that metabolic processing is happening really in an optimal way. And we have full metabolic health. And if we are further down the spectrum, we want to do things to reverse and push ourselves back towards the beginning of that spectrum. So it's really a longitudinal thing. And I often think of metabolic health as something that we're working towards throughout our entire lives. And so it really is about making changes that you can sustain over your entire life. That's how I see it.
What are the 5 metabolic markers then?
So one thing that I should start by saying is that this field is really evolving and the research is really evolving. And I think if you ask that question to different physicians and different researchers, they would answer it differently. So what I'll share are some markers that I think are becoming increasingly acknowledged as being important pieces of the puzzle. Because a lot of this for metabolic health is really about taking different inputs, different data sources, and creating a more holistic picture of your health. So some of the markers that people will use are some of the basics that are used for a lot of conditions. So BMI, waist circumference, weight if you don't have BMI, but those, of course, are very closely linked. There's some specific markers in terms of labs that we look at. So fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, fasting insulin, if you have access to it. And we can talk more about the way that different labs fit together. Oftentimes, physicians will look at hypertension when they're considering someone's metabolic health. And there's a few others that get mixed in there. But really what you're trying to understand is just how is your body processing food? And how can you see the effects of that in your weight, in your waist circumference, in your labs, and then putting all of that together to try to understand what's really happening.
Right. With the, I suppose, measurement of your metabolic health, like I guess historically, what have been the ways that we or doctors would have determined somebody's metabolic health, or was it a case of, well, we didn't really take much notice of it?
So historically, I think metabolic health has been often considered synonymous with blood sugar. And there, when physicians think of abnormal blood sugar, they're really thinking about prediabetes and diabetes, and then during pregnancy, gestational diabetes. And the way that those have traditionally been measured is through fasting glucose, which is your blood sugar when you wake up in the morning after not having eaten for about 10 hours, and hemoglobin A1C, which is a way of looking at essentially what your average glucose has been over the last few months. The idea is that if you have a normal fasting glucose and your average glucose over the last few months is within the normal range, that everything is fine with your metabolic health. But that's the piece that's really starting to change. And I think what's being recognized is that those markers, and specifically fasting glucose, it's really just a snapshot in time. It's that one morning that you went in there and had that blood test done. And it doesn't necessarily, or it almost never tells the full story. And that's for one, because it's just a snapshot. So it's affected by what you ate for dinner the night before, how well you slept, your stress levels, whether you worked out hard before you took the test, right? There's all these factors, but also the body is really resilient. And what we're learning is that you can have a normal fasting glucose for years, despite the fact that actually metabolic dysfunction is happening and actually continuing to advance forward. And the reason for that is because glucose is one of the markers, but there's other things happening in your body that work really hard to keep that glucose in check. And so without getting too much into the weeds, essentially insulin, which much of your audience I'm sure is familiar with, insulin is the hormonal signal that tells your body to take glucose out of the blood and move it into your muscles and other cells. And so when your blood sugar rises, you release insulin and the blood sugar comes down. And so what happens in people as they start to develop metabolic dysfunction is their blood sugar is actually getting high, but they're releasing a lot of insulin and they're bringing that blood sugar down. And what this means is that two people, let's say you and me, can have the same fasting glucose. So we go into the doctor in the morning, we get our blood sugar done. Yours is 80, mine is 80. Those are both normal. But it might take my body, let's call it 50 units of insulin to keep my blood sugar at 80, and it only takes your body 2 units of insulin. By that, we can conclude almost certainly that you are much more metabolically healthy than I am, because you're able to have normal blood sugar in the absence of large amounts of insulin. And I can get to normal blood sugar, but I have to work really hard at it by constantly pumping out insulin. So that's just one example of where a fasting glucose number really doesn't tell you what's happening. And I think it's becoming more and more acknowledged that if we want to evaluate someone's metabolic health, we have to look at a lot more than just these traditional tests for prediabetes and diabetes.
So insulin resistance, then, just to be clear, is that is basically where is it the absence of the production of insulin, or the reduction, or both?
So it's actually almost the opposite of that. And the analogy I like to use is a parenting analogy, which is that insulin is the signal, like I said, that tells the body to take glucose out of the blood and put it in the cells. And so if you imagine that you have a parent and a child, and the parent typically communicates with the child through speaking, but then let's say yells all of a sudden, that child is probably going to really respond to that parent yelling. Likewise with insulin. If you typically don't have a lot of insulin being released, and then you eat something that spikes your blood sugar and you get this big spike of insulin, your cells are going to really respond to that insulin because it's like a parent yelling. It almost never happens. However, if a parent is always yelling at their child, the child starts to become desensitized to the yelling, right? Because they're like, oh, that's just how my parent communicates with me. They're always yelling. And so if the parent wants to get their attention, they have to really scream. The same is true in the body. If you're constantly eating foods that spike your blood sugar, then you're constantly releasing insulin. Insulin's always at a high level. That's basically like insulin constantly yelling at the cells. It's telling the cells to take up that sugar, but it's yelling so much that the cells actually become desensitized to that signal. That's insulin resistance. And then if you want those cells to respond, you have to really scream, to follow the analogy, at those cells by producing just an immense amount of insulin. And what happens over time is that essentially that screaming has to get louder and louder and louder for the cells to respond. And that's the resistance increasing. And eventually the cells just are not able to respond. There's so much insulin, but you still can't get the blood sugar out of the blood, the sugar out of the blood. Um, and that's when you finally see blood sugar ranges start to be abnormal. So by the time you have prediabetes or diabetes, you have exhausted that entire system. There is so much insulin being produced and you still can't keep your blood sugar in the healthy range, then you're clearly outside of the ranges of normal. And so when people talk about insulin resistance, what they're talking about is that increasing process of desensitization of the cells to the insulin.
And what would be some of the, I guess, serious outcomes of, I suppose, living a life like that where you're becoming desensitized to insulin? You know, are there any sort of obvious and quite serious diseases that happen, you know, once you get yourself into that position?
Absolutely. So there's day-to-day changes that people notice, and then there's changes that happen in the long term. So in the short term, many people will notice that their quality of life really goes down. And I should say will notice in the sense that if you go from being metabolically healthy to unhealthy, you'll notice a change. Unfortunately, I think most people are normalized to being somewhat metabolically unhealthy. And so maybe these are things that you've noticed over a long amount of time. But it's some of the things I mentioned before. So for example, fluctuations in mood, feeling hangry or just hungry shortly after you eat, sleeping but never really feeling like you're fully rested, or really not sleeping well, having very disrupted sleep, weight gain or a lot of difficulty losing weight. Women will notice changes in their menstrual cycles. Many people will notice skin changes. Interestingly, blood sugar can actually lead to wrinkles, which some people find very motivating as a reason to work on blood sugar. But of course, really, that process that you can see on the outside happening to the skin, there's very similar processes happening internally as well that you can't see. And then in the long term, poor metabolic health, metabolic dysfunction is linked to 7 of the 10 leading causes of death and many chronic conditions that many of us are very aware of us. So cardiovascular disease, dementia. In fact, many people are now calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. That's how closely linked dementia and blood sugar control seem to be based on the most recent research. The leading cause of infertility in the US is linked to metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance, obesity, of course, and then prediabetes and diabetes. So really, metabolic health is the core of so many other aspects of health, and it is so closely connected to so many other chronic conditions.
I was reading on your website, like it was 2 things. One is that women seem to be, I guess, would it be more sort of vulnerable than men to metabolic disease?
Yeah, it's interesting because unfortunately, women are at a higher risk of metabolic dysfunction and its downstream effects. And this is both due to sexual differences, which is to say physiological differences, but also gender differences, which is to say socially constructed differences in the impact of the difference in experience that women and men have as they live their lives. And so there's actually really fascinating evolving research looking at, for example, the effects of trauma in women and how that impacts their metabolic health. But also on the physiologic side, the impacts of pregnancy, the impact of hormonal changes going through menopause. And unfortunately, it's clear, at least right now, that women are at a higher risk of metabolic dysfunction and that risk kind of gets stronger and stronger over time. And so there's a lot of reason that women especially, but women and men, should really be attuned to their metabolic health and be in many ways having to be the driver of their own medical journey when it comes to this, because the research is so new. But I think increasingly the awareness is there. And of course, things like infertility don't just affect women, they also affect their partners. And so, and interestingly, I should note, metabolic dysfunction is actually also linked to differences in fertility in men. So this is actually shared across both. There's just been more exposure and kind of awareness around infertility as it relates to women. But these are issues that affect both genders and also anyone who loves women or is in partnership with women or has family members who are female.
I also saw that for men, erectile dysfunction, low testosterone levels as well were a result of poor metabolic health. Right. There was an interview I think you guys did with the doctor that talked about it, and I guess those are things that you don't really think of straight away, that your health would have that kind of impact either. That's
right. And I think it really reflects just how far-reaching metabolic health is. when you think about one of the many impacts of having high levels of insulin, which happens as you become insulin resistant because you have to have high levels in order to keep your blood sugar in a kind of healthy range, is that it creates a lot of inflammation, and it creates inflammation in the vessels. And that impacts the brain, that impacts the heart, and in men that impacts the penis. And so really this idea that our bodies, each piece is separate, I think we all acknowledge now is not right, but it's pretty fascinating when you really see the connection between all of these things. It's the same mechanism impacting different parts of the body.
With the medical community, like what are some of the common, I'll call them cures, but what does and I'm not sort of slating anyone in the medical community either, so I'm not trying to sort of misunderstand my question here, but what are some of the common ways that this has been dealt with, if you would go to the doctor, I suppose, outside of going to, well, let's say that first. What would they do? Is there any medications that they put you on that probably have also other impacts, and may not necessarily solve the heart of the problem?
Historically, I don't think that insulin resistance prior to a prediabetes diagnosis has been recognized essentially at all. I would say there are specific conditions where it's been recognized that insulin resistance plays a role. For example, in polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is the leading cause of infertility in the US and impacts about up to 1 in 4 or 1 of 5 women of childbearing age. So it has been recognized, for example, in conditions like that insulin resistance is playing a role. But broadly speaking, I think in the absence of a prediabetes diagnosis, no physician would take any action for what you believe is essentially insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. Even in today's world, and I say this with complete respect for my physician colleagues, I just don't think that is part of the kind of acknowledged traditional sphere of medical practice right now, is subclinical or pre-diabetes, let's call it, insulin resistance. When you get to a prediabetes diagnosis and eventually to a diabetes diagnosis, the typical treatments have been medication. And really, even if you think about the way that diabetes has been treated over many years, and I think this is finally beginning to change, but for a long time, basically what diabetics were told is you just go about eating as you normally would, but you count your carbs and you use that to calculate what your insulin dose should be. And of course, that doesn't really make sense, right? Because what we're saying is that you should just keep doing things that will probably spike your blood sugar, because almost every aspect of a traditional diet is going to spike your blood sugar. And then you're going to compensate for it by injecting insulin. And we know as a medical community that injecting insulin comes with many of its own risks, just in terms of trying to, among other things, get the dose right. It's very confusing to try to understand that. Finally, now, I think there's recognition that an alternative way to treat diabetes, a way that is probably much more effective and safer, is to get people to start eating foods that spike their blood sugar less. So to reduce the burden that their body has in terms of trying to keep blood sugar in a normal range. And diabetes is a very complex condition. And so there's many things that go into treatment. I have several close friends who have diabetes, and I know from their experiences that even for the absolute most proactive person, it is very challenging. And so I don't want to diminish how challenging it is, but this is really just to say that the medical community, mostly up to this point, has just treated with medication. And so my hope is that actually a lot of the kind of awareness and new research that's coming out about insulin resistance prior to diabetes will actually also help to inform treatment for prediabetes and diabetes by just applying the same principles to what is essentially a later stage version of the same mechanism.
I wasn't aware of any of that, actually. That's quite surprising when you look at how the far-reaching impacts of this condition, if that's what you call it, that there isn't more things that can be done, because it is most of it is are habits that you can create, that you can see a relatively quick impact. Well, relatively quick. You can start sort of noticing changes, and it's quite surprising that nothing's being done about it. But then when you look at some of the numbers that we said earlier, I guess it's not surprising how bad things are and how sick we are as a society when we don't have this type of education. I think one of the things that got me into this, and I want to talk about it a little bit, and it's not by any means meant to be a plug, but I obviously was turned on and made aware of my metabolic health and my insulin levels and a number of other sort of key markers through the product that you represent, which is called Levels, a relatively new product which is on the market. And I was curious, what was the reason that your team decided to develop a product that would allow us to be able to get that information?
Our team, and I think in this way, maybe we're biased because we're so deep into it, but I think really our team really, really believes in and is passionate about the impact of reversing the metabolic health crisis. I think I can say from my perspective, I think metabolic dysfunction is so widespread. The damage is so great to our collective health, and the answers to it, the ways to treat it, are essentially all under our control. It all comes down to diet, exercise, stress, sleep, and several other kind of perhaps less large levers. But those are 4 pillars that we know can reverse metabolic dysfunction. We know can promote continued metabolic health in someone who has it. And those things, by and large, are accessible to almost everybody. And so I think what really inspires us as a team is this combination of a problem that we know is so big and a solution that we know is possible. And so it's really just, how do you take those 2 things and create tools for people to be able to make the changes that they need to improve their health? I know many people on the team have also had personal experiences with getting their blood sugar under control and what a huge difference that's made in their lives, including people who, for example, one of our founders is very, very active in terms of physically active in fitness, and was a very competitive athlete, and was eating energy bars as his source of fuel and was crashing throughout the day and just couldn't figure out what was happening. He started experimenting with his diet, and he tried a vegan diet and he tried these other things. But of course, as it ends up, these other diets were actually also high in carbs. For example, a vegan diet is often very high in carbs because people stop eating many sources of fat and protein. And so he was still crashing. He just couldn't figure it out. He had gone to his physicians. And finally, he stumbled upon blood sugar as a possible answer, and he completely changed his entire diet, and that changed his entire experience in his body and his sense of health. And so many individuals, myself included, have had experiences like that, and really just want to be able to share that with the people that we care about, and also with the larger global community.
The thing I was interested, piqued my interest in this is there's something you guys call behavior change, this behavior change philosophy, and I was, as I sort of read into what that meant and then kind of linked that to my experience. And I've actually been using the product now for the best part of a year. Every other month I've been using it, and I definitely agree that there's this sort of because essentially, for those of you who don't know what it is, I've got like a little thing on my arm, on the back of my arm, and then it connects to an app on my phone, and the app basically gives me a score throughout the day, and it shows me what's happening with the different foods, and it gives me a number. But I guess in relation to this sort of behavior change philosophy, like whether it's for me because I'm fairly competitive or not, I'm not sure, but I'm very consciously aware when I'm wearing it of everything. In fact, to some degree, my diet probably changes about 50% more when I'm using it than not, because of my score fascination. And it's really, even when I go back, I definitely drop back to a level that's better than what it was before I used to take it, because I'm teaching myself what is good and what isn't good, and I'm just more conscious about things. But when I'm wearing it, there's definitely a much higher level of responsiveness to my foods in almost like a bit of an obsessive way. But what is this? Talk a little bit about this behavior change and what you guys have sort of found out as it relates to people creating healthy habits.
Right. So for people who don't know, the the thing that he's talking about being on his arm is a continuous glucose monitor. And it basically tells you in real time what your blood sugar is. And so the first kind of tenet of our behavior change philosophy is closed loop feedback systems and real-time feedback. And so what we mean by that is just that when you eat your food, and actually also when you work out, when you sleep, when you're going throughout your life, you're able to see what the impact is on your blood sugar. And so this creates a much, much tighter feedback loop than we typically can get based on the foods we eat. So for example, you think about traditional dieting for weight loss. People are making changes oftentimes for weeks before they see a change on the scale, right? You have to almost just trust in the process, and you don't really have feedback on whether it's working or not. When you have a continuous glucose monitor, everything you eat, you see immediately what the impact is on your blood sugar. So the feedback is just much faster. And I personally have found that to be very motivating and inspiring, because there's no hiding from your choices, right? You eat something, you see the impact, good or bad, and you can decide what you want to make of that and whether you want to change your behavior or not, but you at least have the data and the information. And that cuts through a lot of the confusion that we're talking about, for example, with marketing at the grocery stores. If you eat something and you know what it does to your blood sugar, you don't have to rely on marketing. So there's an aspect here of just improving the information that we have about our food choices. So that feedback loop is the first part of our approach to behavior change. And then the second part is really the ability to then feel those changes in your blood sugar in your own body. So interoception, which is to say, eventually what we hope is that you don't need a continuous glucose monitor to know if your blood sugar is stable. That actually you come to learn how stable blood sugar feels in your body. You come to learn how high blood sugar spikes feel in your body. You learn what blood sugar crashes feel like in your body. So that ultimately you're becoming just much more sensitive to your body's own signals and information, so that even if you're not wearing a monitor, you can know that, wow, I feel something. My blood sugar must really be spiking. Okay, now I know that the next meal I have today, I'm going to try to eat something that I know will keep my blood sugar stable. Or, wow, I feel my blood sugar spiking. I'm going to go for a walk if I can, or I'm going to get up and stand up, or take a walk to the bathroom, or do some dishes, whatever it might be. So kind of taking the closed loop feedback system and then really creating autonomy that you yourself can be the sensor. You don't need an extra sensor. And because of those two things, having the sense of self-control and kind of autonomy, that you actually can be in charge of your health. Because ultimately, we can't rely on our physicians to be in charge of our health. The average physician has a panel of thousands of patients. They see you for maybe, at least in the United States, they see you for maybe 15 to 20 minutes a year. So for us to put all of the weight of our health and wellness on that person, it's just not realistic. So really part of the kind of hope of Levels is that this becomes a tool that allows you to really be in charge of your own health, to say, I know the choices to make for my body. I don't need those to come from a physician in my 15-minute annual visit. I know that they're right for me. And so the empowerment is really the kind of final step of our behavior change approach.
What amazed me is how personal it was. You know, you can, as I do, I interview lots of people about this, and I'm in a space where I rub shoulders with people that just do this for the living. So I can pretty much ask, you know, I can get access to information a lot easier than most people. And yet a lot of the information that you get or read, or even that seems to be common knowledge, it surprised me how generic the information is, but how unique we all are. And I'm not just saying as individuals, I'm saying that how unique we are on a Monday, how unique we are on a weekend, how unique we are if we're traveling, how unique we are if we have stress. Like all of these things that I've come to learn have relatively significant impacts on doing exactly the same thing. Is that something that you would agree with, or is it just me?
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. I think personalization applies in between people, and it also applies to ourselves each day. Because really, like you said, our bodies are so impacted by so many aspects of our lives that the way that we process food really changes day to day. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've certainly had the experience of seeing blood sugar spikes that are simply due to not getting enough sleep. And no matter what I eat that day, my blood sugar is going to spike because my body is not resilient to food that day. I have a close friend who had a big fight with her partner. And she noticed that her blood sugar spiked higher during that fight than it did from any food that she had ever eaten before. And interestingly, when they resolved that fight, a few hours later, that's when her blood sugar finally came back down. And those are just two examples of the ways that blood sugar is so specific to everything that's happening in our bodies. And this is where I think having a tool like a continuous glucose monitor is really helpful, because you start to learn those patterns and you start to kind of say, oh, okay, I didn't get any sleep last night. Maybe I was up all night with the kids or whatever happened. I know then today that I'm going to crave carbs more. I'm going to crave sugar more, because that's what happens when we don't sleep well. And I also know that I'm not as able to be resilient to those carb loads. So you go into the day saying, like, I know I'll crave these things, but maybe I'll try to make another choice, because my body can't handle it that well today and it won't actually help me feel better. So I think understanding personalization day to day can actually be very empowering. And it takes some patience to learn all of those patterns, but you do get there. And it's pretty amazing once you do.
I'm going to jump into that one actually, because I was going to talk about the sort of the pillars of health that you guys refer to, which is diet, sleep, stress, and exercise. And you mentioned one that that I was very surprised about, which was stress. And so I had I don't know, about 4 or 5 months ago, we have a family business, and it can be quite stressful at times, particularly board meetings. And every now and again it gets heated, and I disagree with my brother about something. And there was a particular time where it was a very heated debate, and we both got pretty stressed. Anyway, we had the meeting. I went back, and then I went onto my levels and I had a look at it, and I'm like, what have I done? Because I do intermittent fasting, and we'll come on to that in a minute, whether it's good or bad, but I do this. So I don't generally until about 12. And this was, I think, sort of 8 or 9, relatively early in the morning. And I had this huge spike and couldn't work out what had caused it, because it was almost like I just had a cookie or something. It was pretty serious. And then I got thinking, and I went back and I looked at the timings and the agenda and everything, and I'm like, it was that conversation, it was that argument that we had. And obviously what it had done, it had created this huge dump of I guess, it would be glucose in my system, I suppose, maybe because my body thought I was under threat, which I probably was from my brother. and it had given me this sort of boost of energy. And then I suppose, as I started to research and look online at what this does, I was then thinking, well, look, how many times in a day are we having, you could eat perfectly well, you could exercise, but if you're in a stressful relationship or business situation, how many times a day are you having these huge spikes, and then you're having the opposite to control them? And that, this yo-yo effect that goes on through the day. And then what else is that impacting? Because I understood that you're getting, you're having this adrenaline burst. And it wasn't until I had something kind of stuck into my arm, how frightening it was with what was really going on in my body.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny because everyone is always saying stress is bad for you. Don't be so stressed. But it's hard to really feel that that's tangible. Right? Most people, I think, including me in the past, have said, well, stress is just part of life. I lead a high stress life. It's fine. But when you see the impact of it on something as simple as your blood sugar, you really do realize that stress is powerful. And it can be used to our advantage in the right scenarios. And it also can be very costly for our health. And it kind of makes sense that blood sugar would spike from stress, because if you think about it as being in fight or flight, really your body's preparing to potentially have to fight or flee. And so it makes sense that you would need some glucose released so that your muscles can use it to do those activities. I think the problem often with humans is that we get into that state, we release all that blood sugar, we're ready, we have a cortisol spike, we're ready, and then we don't have to fight or flee, because so much of our lives is around emotional turmoil and other kinds of, like what you described, interpersonal conflict, which is very real stress. But if you actually do raise your blood sugar and then you do run or you do get in a fight, you actually use that blood sugar. You're burning it off because your muscles are using it. And that's a relatively healthy physiologic response to stress. But what often happens in humans is we get all revved up and then we sit back down at our desk. And now we just have, right, like we have this whole cocktail of hormones, this whole cocktail of not just blood sugar, but other things as well. and we don't use them. And it just kind of sits there. And ultimately over time, maybe it starts to wear off and we get to another state, but then we get stressed again. It happens again. And this is a whole nother conversation around acute versus chronic stressors. But I think the blood sugar really reflects how closely these things are linked. And when you think about people who have high stress lives, often also probably aren't getting high quality sleep, maybe because of the stress are not able to eat in the way that they would optimally, maybe are not having time to exercise. And so these things tend to kind of catapult on each other. And one behavior leads to another behavior. I know this has happened for me. And so I think part of the work that we try to do is to break that cycle and to just start with one or two healthy behaviors and then build from there.
Yeah, it was probably the most shocking thing for me that I'm like, okay, if there's obviously a lot more under the surface that's going on with that. And I do have a relatively stressful, owning a business is relatively stressful, but you imagine that was just one moment, one meeting, one day. You imagine that over 20 or 30 years, and combining it with some of the other things that you said, just what damage that alone could do, let alone, combining it, as you said, with sleep and then maybe a not so great diet and then maybe not exercise. You're driving yourself into an early grave. The other thing that's related to stress, which I thought was quite interesting, is mood. And I'm still relatively new into testing this, but I was looking at the correlation between when my insulin levels are good and what my mood's like, and when they're not good and what my mood's like, and whether I see the world through a happy lens or a not so happy lens. And there was definitely, I'm starting to see, and I'm not totally, it's not totally conclusive, but there does seem to be something about the correlation between my perception, my mental health, and then what's going on under, with my reading. So is that something that is anything about, and is that something that's actually real?
There's been a long established connection between diabetes and depression. That's been kind of acknowledged by the medical community for some time. What's really interesting is that there is also research now showing that insulin resistance, so before even a prediabetes diagnosis, just insulin resistance, so the early stages of metabolic dysfunction, are also linked to the development of depression and, in some studies, anxiety. So I think there's a very real connection between metabolic health and mental health, and that is really being discovered more and more. And it's pretty fascinating, and it makes sense because your brain is a massive user of glucose. And so how well your body's able to metabolize energy, of course, is going to impact your brain function. And it's already been shown that blood sugar is linked to the parts of the brain that are responsible for reward, for memory, for learning, for all these things that we know also have a link to mood. So I think this is one area that over the next few years, we're just going to see a huge amount of research coming out, as well as individuals who are now tracking their metabolic health, being able to say, like you did, well, I've noticed this and I've noticed that. And this is something that we're actually really excited about at Levels, which is that we have a very large study going on now, which is really the first of its kind, looking at glucose patterns in people who do not have diabetes. So trying to establish a baseline of what is typical in non-diabetics. And as part of that, we'll probably do some research on people's experience with mood, their symptoms that they have, and other aspects of that. So we're really hoping to play a part in understanding this better.
I'm going to go on to diet now, because there's some selfish questions here, because I've not fully been able to figure all of these things out. But the first one I wanted to get your thoughts and advice on is fasting, because there was a bit of research. I don't know how recent it was, and I don't know whether the research was necessarily related to people that were healthy or unhealthy. But obviously there's a lot of talk at the moment about fasting and intermittent fasting. I tend to do intermittent fasting, have done for quite a while, and then I'll have like a 24-hour fast once a month, first Monday of the month. But it was kind of saying that some of the research on people that skip breakfast had a higher health risk. I don't know whether you know about that study, and I was curious to know, was that just because people that skipped breakfast were fairly stressed, they didn't have a great balance in life, and maybe that could have skewed it? Or do you know anything about, as it relates to your metabolic health, is it good to have a sort of a bit of a clear out? Because I certainly find that helps to stabilize, well, not stabilize, kind of get back to a certain baseline, rather than continuing to eat on a regular basis. So what's your thoughts on fasting and intermittent fasting?
This is another area where I think the research is really emerging. There's some initial research that I think suggests that fasting can be very beneficial and very healing, but I think there's a lot of personalization in this as well. And so I think there's no question at this point that giving your body a break from food, especially overnight, if that's mostly because that's the easiest time for people, that is a healthy thing to do. We know that if you eat close in time to when you go to sleep, and especially if your blood sugar is elevated when you go to sleep, that your blood sugar control during the night will be negatively impacted by that, and that the quality of your sleep will be lower. So I think there's no question in the science at this point that having stable, low blood sugar throughout the night is healthiest. And the way to achieve that is by giving your body a chance to function without continuing to put food into it. So I don't think anyone would argue with the idea that it is likely best to give yourself some amount of time every night when you're not eating. I think where the nuance comes in is how long to intermittent fast, what intermittent fasting really means, how to introduce these longer fasts like what you're describing, and then how that is personalized, like I said, to each person. For example, a lot of the research on intermittent fasting has actually been done in men. And so while those results have attempted to be applied to women, I think there's a lot of reason to think that female physiology is different, especially when it comes to energy balance and fasting. And there's one of the Levels advisors, Sarah Gottfried, has actually done quite a bit of speaking and writing on the topic of adapting not only intermittent fasting, but also things like the keto diet to women. And one thing that she has noticed is that for some women, when you push the intermittent fast too long, so for example, trying to do 16 hours, 18 hours, that actually results in a cortisol spike, which is to say the release of a stress hormone. And what she's noticing is that women, when they push too far, it actually creates a stress response, and that then is not healing. That likely is moving in the direction that they don't want to be in. There's others who have noticed that people who do long intermittent fast are more likely to overeat later in the day, right? They basically play catch up, but they overcompensate. But there's other women who do extremely well on intermittent fasting. There's many women at Levels who actively intermittent fast 16 hours, 18 hours, and their health has really benefited from that. So my overall take on intermittent fasting is I think everyone can incorporate some amount of time overnight when they're not eating. But for some people, the optimal will be 10 hours. For some people, it will be 12. For some, 14, 16, 18. And I think that really will depend on each person. So I'm a fan of taking breaks, but also with the caveat that a lot more research is needed to know what's optimal for any one person.
Yeah, I think you've got to test it yourself. And I certainly, I do 16-8, and I think the breaks are good. And it also depends on your diet. Like one of the things that I've noticed and I wanted to ask you about was that, not that I do this very often, but there's a new pizza restaurant not far from where we are. And I like pizzas. And again, they're terrible for me. They destroy my score, but sometimes I just do it. And so we went to this new place, beautiful bread. And I knew it wasn't going to be good when I got back, and it wasn't. But the surprising thing was that, and we did this on a Sunday sort of relatively early, because I like to finish eating relatively early so I could, it works for me. I'm not going to bed on a full stomach. But the next day, I started my once a month real fast. So I hadn't been eating for quite a while, actually, longer than normal. But yet, obviously, something within this pizza had caused it to stay elevated, like right through the next day without anything. So, is it in your experience? Are there certain foods that can just elevate for an unusually long time your glucose?
Absolutely, and I think this is another one where it also is really impacted by other things happening in your life, but. Oftentimes the spike is related to what the food is that you ate, like you said, but also the portion size. I think we often underestimate the impact of portion size because,
Like this big.
yeah, right. And the thing is, if you have that size of carb load, it can take a very long time for the body to handle that. And it also depends like I said, what else is happening with your digestion. So for example, if you have a very big carb load, but let's say you also have fat and protein, and so therefore the absorption of that glucose is somewhat slowed, which is seen largely as a healthy thing. But that also means that you might be essentially starting to process those carbs over many hours as it moves through your system. That's a very different scenario than you eat something and you have a spike up and you drop back down 30 minutes later. So the answer is yes, there are many ways to get your glucose up and to keep it up for a long time. But in general, that's one of the things that we really try to use as a kind of metric of metabolic health is how quickly can you kind of come back to baseline after a big glucose load. And actually, some of the traditional tests for diabetes, prediabetes, gestational diabetes look specifically at that. It's called an oral glucose tolerance test, and they actually have any woman who's listening who's been pregnant is familiar with this test, but you drink a very, very sugary drink, and then they actually measure your glucose over 2 to 3 hours, and they try to measure how high it gets, and then if it starts to come down. So really what you did is kind of like a version of that, but just for pizza and with kind of multi-hour monitoring.
Yeah, it's really taught me to, if I do pizza, which I don't do very often, but I've figured out that the hack is just to have maybe kind of like a quarter or a half maximum, and I tend to be able to deal with it. But whereas I used to have a large pizza and eat the whole thing, and I also used to feel awful after eating it. I just used to feel as though I had this, I was like stoned in some way. I had this like head rush and all foggy and everything else like that. So I know pizzas are not good for me. I do like them, but I was just surprised that that the length of time for us to process foods that we just don't really recognize is just again another thing that's probably not good for us. I was wondering as well, like how does your gut health influence your score? Because I was obviously certain foods are good for your gut and not, and if you're not feeling particularly well, your gut's not performing optimally. Like I use something called Athletic Greens, and it's got a probiotic, and it tends to sort of help my gut stay pretty good. I've got a little bit of a history of it in the family of sort of sensitive, sensitive in terms of the stomach and that. So I have this, it tends to sort me out. But I also know sometimes when it's not particularly right, food's not great and I don't feel particularly good. So I was just curious, does the health of your gut, and does that have impact on your metabolic health and your metabolic score?
The answer is yes. And this is another area where there's a lot of exciting research coming out. I think there's a lot of evidence that your microbiome is really closely linked to how you process food, and that intuitively makes sense. There's been some interesting studies looking at what happens as people shift their diet. And for example, as people introduce more and more fiber into their diet, for example, in the form of beans or vegetables, that their microbiome actually shifts to be able to handle those better and better, and that's a largely positive shift. And it's for this reason that Levels often recommends that people eat fermented foods or foods that have probiotics with their meals, because we know that kind of really fueling your gut with things that will increase the health of your microbiome is really closely linked to metabolic health.
Right. And when you talk about the what is it called? Not probiotics. What are those? What are they called? You mentioned it, like a certain sour vegetables. There was a name.
Fermented foods.
Fermented foods. Yeah. With those, like where would you put the vinegar? Like I've been reading that it's good to have apple cider vinegar. Like, is that like a fermented food, and is that good to have before, during, or after to assist with the levels?
Apple cider vinegar is interesting because it's actually one of the food hacks, if you want to call it that people use to help balance their blood sugar. Many people have noticed, actually over a long time, I think there's even some information on this in kind of like ancient Chinese medicine, the use of apple cider vinegar or vinegar more broadly to balance blood sugar. But it's certainly something that people have noticed more recently in terms of using apple cider vinegar to help to reduce the spike that they have when they eat food. And also to kind of add to meals for the same purpose. Interestingly, Levels did a very small study looking at some of our members and some of our teammates. And it looks like there's some nuance in this, where, for example, for people who do have a lot of difficulty with their blood sugar, the apple cider vinegar tends to be very impactful. But for people who actually have pretty stable blood sugar, we didn't see that same result. So I think this is another space where people need to just experiment and try it. I personally love apple cider vinegar for the flavor. I think it's great. I love having it as a drink, not straight, but mixed into something. So for me, I would do it with or without blood sugar impact, but it's definitely one of the most popular things that people do to control their blood sugar as well.
I've tried it, and I've had, sometimes it's kind of been, it's actually done what I've wanted it to do. Sometimes it hasn't. But one of the things that I have found to be pretty good about it is if I have it, if I'm eating relatively late and then I have it in the evening before I go to bed, it seems to assist with, I'm not sure whether it's the digestion of food or whatever, but it seems to kind of assist me in my sleep and my levels as I sleep and when I wake up in the morning. I'm not sure what's going on there, but
that's great. You're a positive data point then for apple cider vinegar.
That's right. Desserts. This was another one that I was curious about. Like, not that I'm a big dessert eater, but I know a lot of people are. I found that one of the things that I do enjoy is dark chocolate, and surprisingly, it doesn't mess up my score. Is that just me because I've got an affinity for dark chocolate, or do you find that certain things that you have in a dessert, like certain types of chocolates, etc., are probably better than other ones if you're going to do that?
Luckily, I have the same experience as you do with dark chocolate. I think it largely has to do with the amount of sugar in the food and then also the amount of fat and protein and fiber. So that's really the equation that I follow. And then again, portion size. So I think if you eat 3 bars of dark chocolate, even if it's low sugar per serving, that will be a large load. I think dark chocolate is one of the healthiest desserts that people can indulge in. And as you know, many people will say that cacao also has health benefits separately. But it's interesting because there's actually also a lot of recipes out there that convert favorite desserts of many people, like brownies and cookies and that kind of thing, into keto versions, where the carb load is just massively reduced. So for example, using almond flour instead of normal flour. And maybe at this point, my taste buds have changed so much that I'm not a good judge, but I personally think many of these desserts are very good, or at least as good as the original in my mind, and they don't produce such a blood sugar spike. And so I think something that people don't realize is that you can actually cut down on a lot of sugar and still find little ways to indulge and kind of satisfy those cravings. And then over time, the hope is that your cravings for sweet things reduce. But I personally would never demonize eating a little bit of dark chocolate. I think it's a great pleasure in life. And I think, at least for me, it doesn't seem to impact my blood sugar very much.
What about protein? I work out quite a bit. I interviewed Dr. Gabrielle Leon, and she was telling me that I wasn't eating enough protein. So it's one of the things I've been focused on a lot. But with protein drinks and that, I kind of have a mixed response to it. And so one of the things, if I eat steak, any kind of red meat, that seems to like almost send my glucose in reverse, brings it down really, really low and keeps it there for quite a long time for whatever reason. So that for me is a real positive. And anything that I almost like eat with steak, it's almost like the best thing I can have for my score. When I have protein shakes, and I'm very conscious about what I put with them, I try and use things like avocado or maybe some nuts, and I get a very good quality protein, so there's not sugars, etc. in that. But the score can sort of can vary, and it can vary almost like on a day-to-day basis, even if I mix it up on in a very, very similar way. So what are your thoughts about steak and red meat as it relates to protein, and then also protein sort of substitutes like powders, and if you kind of have these almost like these meal replacement proteins throughout the day?
I think eating meals that have a good balance of protein and fat, healthy fat, definitely are great for blood sugar stabilization. I think this is probably outside the scope of this conversation. There's entire areas of research focused on red meat and animal products in general. So that's a different topic. But I think high quality sources of protein and fat are great. And in terms of the protein shakes, I think the first thing is what you said, which is that oftentimes these shakes come with all kinds of added sugar, added carbs. So people need to just be very sensitive to reading labels about that. If your protein drink is sometimes creating spikes and sometimes not, I think my first question would be whether you are doing activities around eating that shake that would impact that. For example, working out in different ways right before you eat the shake or earlier in the day. My guess is that the response that you're having that's different to the same shake has mostly to do with what else is going on in your life in terms of your body. But it is true that if you eat excess protein, eventually your body will convert that into energy, and people can get little spikes out of protein. You'll hear this most commonly discussed with people on keto diets, where they're discussing whether or not you can eat high levels of protein while you're on the diet. And there's a lot of kind of debate about that, because people have noticed that when they eat very high amounts of protein on a keto diet, it actually takes them out of ketosis. And the reason for that is because of the conversion of protein into glucose.
Yeah, definitely. My assessment of it is, yeah, the protein substitutes are okay, but if really, it's almost like I can't see. I don't. If I have steak with something, that's almost probably because there's a certain amount of steak that you can eat as well. But it almost seems to be a real safe bet that it fills me up. It keeps me stable. I never get any kind of issues. Whereas compared to an artificial protein, I guess, which you call the shakes, that can be a lot more sort of, can be a lot more fluctuations in that one. So the other one that I have these bulletproof coffees, which generally score quite high. I'll have sort of 2 small shots of espresso, and I'll put some MCT oil and some butter. Generally, that's okay. I don't get a 10, which I thought I would, but I get a pretty high score. But what did surprise me is if I have something like a cortado, which is just a little bit of milk, that kind of is not good. And I've checked whether because sometimes they put almond milk and there's probably other stuff in there. I've checked almond milk, I've checked regular milk, but that seems to not give a great score. So what is it about? Is it the coffee? Is it the milks in there? Or is it the fact that maybe it's being taken at a time which will cause it to, create some other impact?
That's interesting. It depends, I think, well, like you said, what milk they're really putting in there and how much. If it's dairy milk has natural sugar from the lactose. So you'll often notice even in just plain milk, there's sugar in there and carbs and naturally occurring. Likewise with yogurt, even plain yogurt with no additives will have natural sugar from the lactose. But if it's a small amount of milk, I would be surprised that would spike you. Dairy is interesting for a separate reason also, which is that researchers have noticed that dairy seems to trigger a higher release of insulin than you would expect for the amount of sugar that's in it. And so this is actually an area of controversy from the medical community, which is, on the one hand, there have been large studies that have shown that people that eat dairy, by and large, have better markers of metabolic health than people who don't eat dairy. But there's also research showing that dairy is leading to higher insulin spikes than you would expect, and that actually can be, of course, negative for insulin resistance and for metabolic health. And so I think the jury's still out on dairy. But that is a slightly separate discussion in terms of whether or not eating dairy is healthy. But in terms of your blood sugar spikes with a little bit of milk and coffee, that surprises me. And that makes me think that there's something else going on, unless the spike is very, very small.
It's not huge, but I would expect it to be relatively flat, and it's a reasonable amount. And I've tried it over a number of times. Like I used to have, so a cortado's got a reasonable amount of milk in it. It's probably that much, like sort of a small cup. So there is more than I suppose, if you're just having an espresso. But that probably does link into, when I was talking about the protein shakes, I do put milk into that as well. And so maybe I need to test the milk with or without the protein shake, because maybe the milk is doing something in relation to what you've just said. That's another one for me to test out then, I guess.
Exactly. You have a whole bunch of experiments lined up for you.
What do you think about the food spacing? Because it certainly seems to, if you follow the guidance of the app, it seems to encourage you have a meal, you wait for it to process and metabolize, which could be a few hours, and then you have another one, as opposed to kind of having, almost like sort of snacks every hour or so, which it almost seems as though you don't have enough time for your first meal to give you a score, and then you've got your second one, and then that's still trying to calculate. And so my guess is the way that it's set up encourages you to space it out. But is that advisable, or if you eat smaller things more regularly in smaller quantities, you're going to get more of a stable metabolic response?
I think this is another place where there's just a lot of personalization. I think the standard response this would be from people in the metabolic health space is that it is best to eat meals and then have space in between them, simply because you want your body to have rest. And for most people, if you're eating a meal that is going to elevate your blood sugar even a little bit, it's very helpful to have time after that when your blood sugar has time to come back down to normal. And you want to have times during the day when you don't have a lot of insulin circulating for a variety of reasons. Among those, for people who are interested in weight loss, it's very hard to lose weight when you have high levels of insulin, because insulin is the hormone that leads to fat storage. So you're actually going in the opposite direction of fat burning. So I think in general, the advice would be you should have times during the day when you're not eating. That said, there is a lot of personalization, and there's people who do very well, essentially grazing all day. But again, if you're grazing, I think you want to be very sensitive to what you're grazing on. So something that I think almost everyone would agree is not going to promote metabolic health is grazing on carbs and sugar. So having, for example, chips and pretzels, and then having a piece of toast, and then having a sandwich for lunch, and then having like a few sweets in the afternoon, that is just going to keep your blood sugar elevated the entire day. Or even worse, in some sense, kind of going up and down and up and down and up and down all day as your body tries to deal with it. But someone who grazes on nuts and seeds, and like maybe some low carb vegetables, I don't think that's nearly as damaging. If damaging at all, it might not be damaging at all, but those people need just to be sensitive to what their diet goals are, because that means that you're essentially nonstop eating. Right. So you just need to be cognizant of how your body deals with that. But I think, again, a lot of personalization here.
Yeah. I certainly see that even unless you're eating sort of really basic food, which then probably isn't the sort of things that you'll be grazing on because they're not that interesting, is it does keep it to a level, and having that break kind of resets and certainly for me, it seems to be more beneficial to have those longer breaks, even though they're a little bit tempting not to. I was wondering about exercise, and I've tried to hack this in some ways, where I have something at the weekend. I have an ice cream with my children. It's kind of like a bit of a treat, and although there's sometimes I've not done it just because I wanted to kind of have a nice run of scores in the 90s, for example, but if I do it, I'm like, okay, right, I need to figure this out. I've got to find some way of just bringing it down really quickly. So obviously I have a small ice cream, which is a good start. But then I'm like, okay, we're going to go for a walk along the beach. We have a long walk in it, and I'm looking at it, and it's keeping it. I sound as though I'm obsessive now, don't I? But I'm checking it. I'm like, okay, we've got this under control. And then maybe after, which seems like a long time, but it could be almost like 45 minutes or something. We'll sit down and sit on the beach or whatever. And then once I stop, then it just like it goes straight back up again, and I almost have to go move. I have to move again for it to level off, and it seems as though the amount of when you say like when they say once you've eaten, go out for a short walk, it seems as though in order to sort of get rid of something like an ice cream, you've got to actually walk or do something for quite a long time, probably an hour, or go and have a workout. Is that your experience of exercise after food?
Right. Yeah. So it really just depends on, I think, what you've eaten and how much glucose and carbs there are there. The muscles really are glucose sinks, which is to say they really use up glucose, which is really great for getting your blood sugar back into the normal range. Exercise is interesting because exercise like walking definitely tends to pull blood sugar down, but super vigorous exercise will actually, for many people, increase blood sugar during that time. And that's totally normal and healthy and physiologic. But in terms of using exercise after meals to bring blood sugar down, I think that's a great tool to have. And it just has everything to do with what the load is that you're trying to work through. I think one thing that's really important for people to know is that even if you just walk 5 minutes, that has an impact. People will notice that actually lowers the peak of their spike and helps them get down faster. Even if they haven't burned everything off to being completely back to baseline, it still makes a difference. So I think any amount of exercise is helpful, and certainly taking an hour-long walk is probably even more beneficial than a 2-minute walk, but anything counts.
Yeah, I think it's obviously I was using an extreme, which was an ice cream, which wasn't great. But I do agree with you. Even after a regular meal in the evening, where if I'm eating late, just going for a walk, it does sort of bring it down. It's just trying to figure out exactly how long to do that for without necessarily taking a kettlebell with me and doing some resistance training. I have noticed, however, that when I do the workouts, I do a workout, then I do a sauna, then I do a cold plunge. I kind of get like these 3 huge peaks. Like the workout spikes the insulin. And although I set it on to say I'm exercising, I get a big spike when I'm working out. I seem to get a big spike and a drop when I go in the sauna. And then I also get a big spike and a huge drop when I go into the cold plunge as well. Is that typical? Is that good or bad for you? Or is it just that when you're doing those types of stressing things to your body that you're going to get that sort of yo-yo effect?
Many people do notice spikes from those activities. One thing about the sauna is the sensor itself can be sensitive to heat. So sometimes people will notice that they're getting a spike in the shower or the sauna, and it's actually not necessarily because their blood sugar is spiking. It's simply because the sensor is being impacted by those extremes. But I certainly notice that I get spikes from being in the sauna that I think are true blood sugar spikes because they take a little while to come down. But that's totally physiologically normal. I don't know that science completely understands how those link into metabolic health more holistically, but certainly I think things like sauna, cold plunge are considered very healthy, and the blood sugar responses are simply responses to the stressors like you're describing.
Right. And with the other thing that spikes, and I wanted to just find out what was going on here, is in the morning as well. Like, is it bad if you wake up and it spikes, or is that just something that your body does to kind of kick you out of bed?
That's known as the dawn phenomena. And really what that is your body preparing for the day. It's often associated with a small spike in cortisol, but it's very common and people notice it regardless of what they've eaten the night before. And especially most people have been fasting overnight, and it still happens. And it's really just your body saying, okay, we're getting ready for the day. We're going to need to get active, and we're going to release some glucose into the bloodstream to facilitate that. So it's a very well acknowledged phenomena and totally normal. And people have done things to see if they can make that spike lower by changing their diet, by increasing their strength training, by doing all the things that help with metabolic health. And sometimes that has decreased, but it's definitely a known phenomena.
Right, and it's not bad if that happens. Then I'm not unusual anyway.
You're definitely not unusual. I don't know that there's been really in-depth research.
Well, I am unusual, but
yeah. I don't know that there's been very in-depth research on exactly the health implications of whether or not you experience that phenomena and what the size of it is. Again, I know that there's some people who have actually really lowered that through changing their metabolic health and improving their metabolic health, but there's others who haven't. And I don't think there is a lot of known kind of conclusions around what that means, but certainly it's not considered dysfunctional if you have that. It's just a known thing that the body does to prep for the day.
Right. So a couple of questions then to finish off, because I've not got through all my own ones, but I'll have to email you to get the answers for the rest of it. But what's kind of next in this wearable market then? Like this is obviously, I guess, a big change in what we've been able to, the regular person has been able to track and measure, and it opens a whole new sphere of understanding and I guess responses and habits that you can change. Like where do you think it will go next? Do you think this will be something that you'll get on your phone that can start, you touch it on the skin and it gives you this information? Like what you guys must be thinking about, the future of this particular area.
We're certainly thinking about the future of hardware innovation and what sensors could look like. I think it would be such an exciting thing if we had sensors that could really detect not just glucose, but other molecules as well. You could imagine how powerful that would be. So there's this whole side of innovation that I think is really exciting on the kind of tech front. And I think the other side is really trying to, like I said before, create ways that people can be in charge of their own health. And in many ways, we don't necessarily need fancy technology to do that. A lot of that comes from education, from understanding behavior change, motivation, learning, reward, right? Like a lot of the tools that, for example, social media has mastered so well around how to get people to change their behavior. I think some of that can be adapted to health. And of course, without the kind of negative sides of social media, but really just trying to understand how to tap into behavior and to use that for good, and to allow people to become independent from the traditional healthcare system, which unfortunately is extremely broken. And so I think there's these two parallel and probably other pathways as well happening at the same time, which is enormous leaps in technology, but also leaps in our understanding of human behavior and what it really takes to help people change their lives from a lifestyle standpoint.
And what would be one other measurement outside of glucose that you think would be, or glucose and insulin? What complementary thing do you think that you're not measuring that could be an interesting one to sort of round out that area?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, I think being able to see hormones like the sexual hormones, I think being able to see stress hormones like cortisol. I mean, the list is really endless. And I think really what it will come down to is how we piece all of those together to create the most holistic view of health that's possible.
And are those hormones things that you can, like with the right technology, are they relatively easy to see? It's just trying to figure out a way of exporting that device, or are they difficult things to accurately measure, would you say?
At this stage, they're mostly difficult.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, look, Lauren, thank you very much. I've drilled you with loads of questions, but it is something I'm very passionate about. I'd recommend, we've got an offer for anyone that's interested. There's a pilot happening in the UK. I don't believe you've launched as yet in the UK. Is that correct?
That's right. But we're inviting everyone to join the wait list.
Yeah, it's going to be launched in the UK soon. So to my British friends, we'll put a link up if you'd like to join the wait list. If you're in the US, it is available now, isn't it, in America? Is that right?
Yes.
It is, yeah. So if you're in the US, I'd definitely recommend checking it out. It will freak you out, but it's very, it's very, very well worth it. So Lauren, thank you very much for your time, and best of wishes for everything else that you're doing.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, then please go over to iTunes and subscribe to the Escape Your Limits podcast. Leave a review, leave a comment. It really would help us a lot to continue to keep these going.